Good evening and welcome to Pull. I'm here at the Shakespeare Theater for a special series of Pull, exploring the Washington, D.C. premiere of The Great Game, a cycle of plays examining almost 200 years of Afghan history. Tonight, I'll learn how Afghan art and culture have transformed the Shakespeare Theater. I'll speak with Ed Grazda, a photographer who has documented life in Afghanistan for more than 30 years, and Timur Zamani, a gallery owner promoting Afghan arts and culture in the United States. First, I'll meet Milad Yousafi, a rabab player who traveled here from London, England to introduce Americans to Afghan music.
میلاد جان تشکر از اینکه شما با امروز با برنامه پل اشتراک کردید. I want to ask you, you're here today at the Shakespeare Theater as part of the cultural exhibition taking place for the Great Game. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I was asked by a friend of mine, Timur Zamani, who's also running parts of his gallery here, exhibiting his craft work from Afghanistan. And he told me about this event and asked me if I'd like to come and acting as an ambassador of Afghan culture and perform for the people in Washington here, perform rabab, and I happily accepted it.
How long have you been playing the rabab?
The rabab, I asked for one about 5-6 years ago, and I managed to get one here from Afghanistan, and ever since then, well, I started off with it was guitar, but slowly I picked up. And
so you knew how to play guitar, but then you asked for a rabab. Well, who taught you how to play the rabab?
I haven't had a rabab lesson. I need to get one day, so I can actually officially say I'm a rabab.
Well, that's amazing, because I heard you playing Afghan songs, traditional Afghan folk songs. So how did you learn how to play those songs?
Well, the songs I know, because I've heard them so much, and you know, I listen to music, etc. And I like Afghan folk songs. So I have the melodies in my head. It's just a matter of translating them into the instrument, which is very similar to guitar. So it's a string instrument, and I just adapt. But with the melodies in my head.
What do you think makes the rabab unique as an instrument?
Well, apart from its unique sound, it's a joyous instrument. It's very lively, and it's used for celebration, festivals, and that's what it represents. But the instrument itself, the sound is a beautiful sound. I mean, I've listened to it all my life, so I thought that's why I like it. But actually, people, non-Afghan people, I live in London, so English people, when they listen to it, they love the sound as well.
When you played before Americans here in Washington, what has been their reaction to the sound of the rabab?
Well, I got a very good reception from the people. I mean, they were nodding along, and I mean, I wouldn't say it's my playing, but it's just the sound and the melodies that our ancestors came up with.
But do you think that music can transcend all of this politics and all of this, negativity that can sometimes exist between the East and West?
Well, music it doesn't have borders. It's I can sit down and play with someone from Zimbabwe or from Malaysia. And we'll get along, because if there's a beat and there's a particular scale we're playing, and you can play along. There's no opinions in music.
Lastly, Milad Jan, as an Afghan who immigrated to the UK, you still decided that you wanted to keep part of your Afghan culture alive by learning an instrument. What would you say to young Afghans inside the country about learning to play a musical instrument themselves?
Yeah, I'd encourage anyone to go into arts, because the arts, I think, kind of represent a nation or a people. It's an expressive way of showing what people are made of. If you want to see the real people, it captures that moment, that time, very well through art.
تشکر تیمور جان از اینکه با برنامه پل امروز اشتراک کردین.
تشکر از شما مریم جان که ما را به برنامه‌تان اینجا آوردین.
I want to, know about your role. I understand that your family has a gallery, the Zamani Gallery,
yes,
where you bring Afghan arts and crafts here to the United States. Can you tell us about how that started?
Sure. My grandfather in the 1940s and 50s, they were dealing in arts and crafts back in the days in Kabul, and we actually come from a little village north of Kabul, Karizimir, and they dealt in fur business, and they would make sheep skin furs, and they would take it to the city and sell it to, and actually export it to Europe back then, and that's how it all started. And then my uncles grew up. My dad, they opened stores in Kabul and Chicken Street and Jadeh Walayat, and they had tourists coming in, so they were selling arts and crafts of Afghanistan from the beginning. And yes, I've continued the family traditions here in the U.S.
And how have Afghan arts and crafts been received by Americans?
They've been very receptive towards them, and that's why we decided to have a gallery here. I finished my studies in the UK, and after that I used to visit to the US, and I thought this would be a great place to open such a gallery to show arts and crafts of the country, especially with what's going on with the conflicts and violence in the country. The people only hear the violent side of the country, so I thought it was very important to show the culture of the
Another
country.
aspect that your gallery has helped to provide some Afghan culture is kites. There's a kite exhibition here. You've even brought your tar here with us, if you can show it.
That's right. This is the actual tar from Afghanistan, and this is what we used to fly our kites with back in the days. And as I hear now, they use chemical strings now, which it takes the fun away from part of the fighting when but this is the real Afghan tar.
So you've imported this into the US.
Exactly, yeah, we've brought it in the US, and I was a big fan of flying kites myself in Kabul when I was there until the age of 11, and I still have scars on my hands and on my foot falling out of a roof and things like that. So, but here we provided kites. We have decorated some on the second floor.
And who made these kites?
These kites were actually made by the Ustad Nur Agha, who lives in Shorbazar part of Kabul. It's an old part of Kabul, and he actually made kites for the movie The Kite Runner, as we all have heard. And he's very famous, just like me, that I have continued my family traditions. Ustad Nur Agha as well, his forefathers were in this line, kite making, and in the old part of Kabul, Shorbazar. So I found out that he made those kites, and we contacted him and ordered kites to be here in the US.
Do you think that you could sell more Afghan kites here in the US?
Definitely. I'm getting calls from all over the US, California, Colorado, everywhere, people asking for Afghan kites.
Timur John, thank you very much for your time and for your efforts in sharing Afghan culture here at the Shakespeare Theatre.
سلاما و احترامات خود برای مردم به داخل وطن که هستند تقدیم میکنم و خوشیشان و صحتمندیشان ما همیشه آرزو داریم. Thank you again.
تشکر بسیار.
زنده باشید.
When we return, I'll speak with Ed Grazda about his experiences photographing Afghanistan over the past 30 years. I'm back with Ed Grazda, a former National Geographic photographer who has worked in Afghanistan since the 1979 Soviet invasion.
Hi Ed, thank you for joining us for our program. You've traveled to Afghanistan more than 20 times in the past. What keeps pulling you back to the country?
The people mostly. right from the first in the early 1980s when I met Afghan refugees in Pakistan. They were so hospitable, friendly, welcoming that you know, it's just something that grows in you, and I made friends and kept wanting to go back.
Have you visited other countries as well to take photographs?
Yeah, I've traveled quite a bit in Latin America and through Asia.
And what made Afghanistan different for you?
Again, the people, the landscape, the culture, the mountains, it's just a really, I mean, a lot of people who have gone there as journalists or photographers, I mean, it's kind of like a drug. You get sucked in because it's such an amazing place, and the history that's there and things. I mean, other countries I've been to I've liked, but I have no reason to go back because there's no kind of link. And with the Afghans, there was a sort of very friendly rapport.
You mentioned going in the early 80s when the Afghans became refugees, a lot of them in Pakistan. Was it difficult to get into Afghanistan during that time?
In the early 80s in Peshawar, any Westerner with a camera, Afghans would come up to you and say, come, we'll take you to see us fighting the Russians. You're BBC, come with us. So it was very, you know, for a photographer, access is the main thing. So to be able to go with Mujahideen and sneak across the border, it was a great opportunity.
Were you an independent photographer or with
I was
a news
independent.
agency?
I was independent.
Ed, you made your first trip with the Mujahideen in 1982. Can you tell us what groups you met at that time or individuals?
Well, in 1980, I was in Peshawar and photographing some refugees, and I photographed Gulbuddin Hikmatyar in his office in Peshawar. And I sent photographs back to his press people. And in 1982, I went back to Peshawar with the idea of going into Afghanistan. So I went to Hikmatyar's office and I said, I'd like to make a trip. And the press officer opened his desk and pulled out the photos that I had sent. So I wasn't so aware of one was more fundamentalist than another or things like that. But I made a trip with Hikmatyar's people and we walked to Bamiyan. And it was grueling, but it was amazing at the same time. This is one of my favorite and telling photographs that I've taken. I took it in 1984 in a village called Wagiza. I had spent the night here with Mujahideen. And what's interesting to me is that it shows three different ethnic groups, Hazara, Tajik, and Pushtun, all fighting together. They were in Rabbani's Jamiat party, but all fighting together against the Soviet invasion.
You know, now looking hindsight at that period of time, what do you think of those times now, that period of the Afghans fighting the Soviet Union?
You know, it was sort of, how can I say it, idealistic, I think. You know, I mean, certainly I wasn't totally aware of what would happen later, but it seemed like this was a decent fight. A small country was being invaded by a big world power, and it seemed like these guys who were walking around in bare feet with old rifles were sort of doing the right thing, and it was sort of interesting to photograph it.
Why is it that you chose not to cover the war in your photographs?
Well, I never looked at myself as a war photographer, and I was really interested in these people who were fighting and their culture and how they lived and survived and the village life and things like that. On many trips, I would go with other photojournalists. They would take a few people in. And you'd go into Afghanistan for a few weeks and you wouldn't see any fighting. I'm taking pictures all the time because I just love the guys hanging out, they're playing music, they're working in the fields, whatever. The quote-unquote professional photojournalist would be very upset because they didn't see any bang-bang, they didn't see any war, and they'd go back.
So do you think that foreign journalists are drawn more to capturing war and showing those images than of peace and of good developments?
Well, that's unfortunately, that's what sells. You know, is the burning tank, the ambush where you see the footage of the Russian dying soldier that a Polish journalist got during the war. You know, he was paid thousands and thousands of dollars for that, because that was a dramatic thing. I wasn't really interested in, if I saw it, I would have photographed it, but it wasn't where I wanted to really go. And I also didn't want to go with the Mujahideen going into battle because they have to take care of you. So you're a liability. And I didn't want to put them in that kind of position.
And as a photographer, I want to talk about, you see something, a subject. What goes on in your mind when you're trying to capture that image?
Well, actually, really nothing. I work very intuitively. So I don't plan out, I mean, just like I never planned to cover Afghanistan for 25 years. It's something grew on me, and I just photograph kind of in the moment. I don't sort of plan and necessarily pose a...
But are there any elements that you're looking for as a photographer when you're looking to capture that perfect image in your mind?
No, it's just kind of you see something that's interesting and you photograph it, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. And again, not working in digital, you rely on yourself to think that maybe that's a good image or maybe not. You don't instantly look at the picture. So you just have to go for weeks at a time without seeing anything. And it's very intuitive the way I work.
So are you still using the kind of traditional photography rather than the new digital photography?
Yes, no digital.
And do you develop your own work?
I do my own work and make my own prints and things, yeah.
Are there any images or any specific image in your mind of photographs that you took in Afghanistan that particularly stayed in your mind? Maybe it's a favorite photograph, or maybe it's a photograph that really conveyed an emotion well.
Well, the one I mentioned of the 4 fighters is one that lasts for me for a long time, because one, just their sincerity in opening themselves up with the way they stand, holding their weapons. I mean, they're very peaceful, but they're holding guns. And again, with the different ethnic groups, to me, it has a real cultural significance about Afghanistan and its history. One of the guys was a school teacher. So that's one image that really constantly resonates with me.
صحبت بیشتر با Ed Grazda.
More with Ed Grazda when we return.
با ما باشید.
I'm back with Ed Grazda.
You've taken these images that you have gotten from your trips to Afghanistan. When you went during the time of the Taliban, can you tell us about that? Because we know that there was a ban against taking photos. How were you able to take photos during that time?
Right. In '97 I went, and the ban was sort of in place, but it was not totally enforced. The minder they gave me, who's still a friend of mine living in Colorado now, was not a Talib. He was just could speak English, so he had this job. So you could work with him, and when you went to the front lines or certain areas, the Taliban there were still okay with being photographed. Sometimes if the commander showed up, he would say no photographs, but usually some of the fighters, Taliban fighters, some of them didn't even know what a camera was, so you could take their picture and things like that. When I went back in 2000, then the Taliban was really in control. I had a Talib minder, and he was more scared. I mean, I wasn't really scared, but he was scared more than me because he was going to get in trouble if I took a picture. This is Kabul in '97 under the Taliban, and again, this was a very lucky shot because I went there with my guide, and we went to this place. It's in Jadi Maiwand section of Kabul. And went up to this Taliban fight and was able to take a few pictures. It's, again, one of my favorite pictures. Went back the next day, and the commander was there, and no photos allowed. So again, it was just a lucky thing of timing. But
and this Talib allowed you to take his photo?
He allowed me to take it. And I think in some ways it really sums up the Taliban, his half covered, you're not sure what's going on.
And after 2001, what kind of images were you able to take from Afghanistan?
Well, that was different because suddenly the whole world was there. I mean, I went to Tora Bora, I was at some of the loyal jirgas and things like that. And so it was a lot of pictures of, kind of political things going on in Kabul and posters and things like that. For me, it was more frustrating because suddenly you had to have ISAF and NATO and all these different kind of passes and things. I mean, it was almost impossible to get into the loyal jirga. I had to kind of sneak in, even though I've been covering this for 25 years and I know all the people in the jirga. I wasn't an official press thing, so it was very difficult to get access to those things. It was a little frustrating. And it's really why I stopped going after 2004, because I don't like the whole militarization of the country and these permissions and being embedded. It doesn't really, it's not about the culture of Afghanistan anymore, it's more a war.
So you just mentioned covering the culture. I mean, you've been to Afghanistan more than a lot of probably Afghan expats who left the country after the war started. What element of Afghan culture through those periods of time have you come to respect?
the hospitality, the music, poetry, food, just the life of Afghanistan really interests me. And also, as an American, you know, to go to a country which has a tribal culture, even though there are problematic issues with tribal societies, is fascinating. So as a photographer with no real agenda, to see this tribal world and how people in villages, you know, these things, it was really fascinating.
And some people say that those differences in Afghanistan, if you go and photograph the faces, that's what makes it interesting. Did you find that diversity interesting as a photographer?
Oh yeah, it's amazing. And again, the people are so open, and again, they love photographs. That's the contradiction. People think, oh, they don't like, you know, photography. I never met an Afghan who didn't want his picture taken.
So that's an interesting point, is that some people might think, okay, this is a very restrictive, traditional society. So when you've taken photos of Afghan people, what has been their reception or their feedback on that?
Well, I've always, right from the 80s, like when I sent the pictures to Hikmat, I always sent pictures back to friends of mine. And I mean, when I was in 2001, someone comes running up to me on the street. It's the son of a commander that, I mean, I photographed this guy when he was a little boy. He's 25 now. They take me to his house. His father has a photo album with my pictures that I send, pictures of me. You know, there was always this back and forth with pictures with the Afghans, which I love. I mean, still friends have albums, you know, and my pictures. Even when I was in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen, I'd get back to Peshawar and someone would have color snapshots of me already that they had taken when I was in Afghanistan. So as a photographer and someone who's interested in images, this was really a wonderful kind of back and forth with the Afghan people. You know, they really love the pictures.
What about women? I mean, you know, it is more difficult, but were you able to photograph women and it not be a problem?
In '92 in Kabul on the street, I was able to photograph women and they just had a scarf, they weren't really covered up and things like that. But the first day I got to Kabul under the Taliban, I was just walking outside near the post office there, and sometimes I just take pictures, just kind of lift the camera and take it. And this Talib came up to me and like slapped me across the face and knocked my glasses off and grabbed my arm, and you were taking a picture of a woman and things like that. And my guide came up and sort of cooled it, but it was like the one instant when someone really was, you know. And again, I didn't want to push the issue of photographing women.
Well, Ed, I want to thank you for your time and for sharing your stories about being a photographer covering Afghanistan in the 80s, 90s, 2000. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
My thanks to the Shakespeare Theatre Company for hosting us. My thanks also to Ed Grazda, Malad Yousafi, and to Mir Zamani for sharing their work with us. You can view this and any other Pull program by going to aamtv.tv or tolo.tv. Join us next week for another edition of Pull.